Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry I'm running a little behind today. Some quick announcements before we start. So I had changed the schedule for this week to sort of stick in one more lecture because we were falling behind a little bit. I came to the realization over the weekend that that's just cruel and unusual punishment to make you have another lecture while we have a midterm on Thursday. So that extra lecture is just going to go away. I'll probably move it to next week. And so instead, 4 o'clock during our discussion period, we'll actually discuss the midterm. That will be the regular midterm review. And then the problem session will still be a homework problem session because you have a homework that's up online now. There is kind of an extended semi-numerical problem on there. It's sort of like walking through different stages of how you calculate energy for molecules. So I wanted to make sure you had the opportunity to ask questions about that before it's due. So we'll be having the midterm review at 4 on Wednesday and the homework review at 7 on Wednesday. And okay. And then, of course, 9:30 on Thursday is when we'll have a midterm review. Any questions on that schedule?
What should we bring to the midterm?
Great question. So all my midterms, in fact, I'm going to actually post last year's midterm up there after class. You should just need to bring a pencil or pen, preferably a pencil so you can erase things, and a calculator. You don't need a Scantron. All the things can be answered on the test form. You'll get this like relatively thick test form, and don't let it scare you. It's just I'm giving you a place to do your work, so it's not too long a test. But just pencil and a calculator. And one of these, like, you just need like a simple calculator, like 4 function calculators, multiplication, division, stuff like that. Any other questions? Okay, so like I said, I'll put up last year's midterm and the solutions right after class. And if I get an opportunity, I'll try to post kind of just a short review on what will be covered on the midterm, but we'll be talking about that tomorrow as well. Things you should be studying, by the way, for this are all of the sort of review questions I asked at the beginning of the lecture, all of the think, pair, share, the card questions. Hopefully you have your cards for today. Questions I asked in the middle of the lecture, stuff on the homework. Obviously, I'm not going to ask like really long quantitative problems, but there will be a quantitative problem section on there. So make sure you review how we do the problems in the homework assignments. Crystal clear? Yes, ma'am.
Where is the midterm review? Is it here or in
Solus. Yeah.
And the problem session is still in Solus?
Problem sessions in Center Hall, 220 or 222 or something like that. We only moved it here last week for the lecture just because the lecture doesn't have, the Center Hall I don't think has as good of a presentation setup. Yeah.
The problem session is still optional, correct?
Yeah, you don't have to go. I'm just giving that as an opportunity to, get help on the homework. Not work hard. Yes, ma'am.
Do we need to memorize any constants or formulas?
No, you'll have an equation sheet, so I'll make sure that that's up as well on our website. Yeah. Okay. So because so we're going to do Wednesday as news report. Who is Wednesday? I forgot. Yeah. Okay. So can we move you two to Tuesday next week? I figured that'd be better than saying, "Hey, you guys ready? Let's present right now." Okay. So Tuesday next week, and so anybody want to volunteer for Thursday next week? Okay. All right. Okay, so send me your topics probably by the end of this week or early next week, and I'll request yours by the end of this week as well. Okay, now I also was a little late getting homework 4 number posted, so instead of having this due on Friday right after the midterm, I figured I'd give you an extra weekend to work on that, so that'll be due on Monday. But don't let it slide. Remember, we still have problems. I have office hours and there's a problem session, so make sure you take advantage of those, and don't wait till Sunday and then realize you need help on the problems because I don't check my email on Sunday, so that might be a problem. All right, any questions on that? Okay, so let's do a quick sort of warm-up quiz to sort of remember the things that we're talking about. Remember, we're talking about sort of characteristics of life. What were the 6 characteristics we talked about last week?
Response to environment.
Response to environment,
Growth and reproduction.
growth,
Order.
and reproduction is actually 2.
Evolutionary.
Evolutionary adaptation, or Darwinian evolution. Energy utilization, or metabolism.
Order.
Order, I think we had, yeah.
No, we didn't.
Oh, we didn't?
No.
Okay, then there must be 6. I must have gotten them. Okay, so order, all right, reproduction, growth and development, energy utilization, response to the environment, I don't think we had that one. And evolutionary adaptation, right? Now these individually are not sufficient for life because we thought of lots of different examples where you could have one of these aspects for something that manifestly is not living. But if we look generally at life here on our planet, and that's the only example of life that we know of so far, these characteristics seem to be very common for all those life forms. All right, true or false? Evolution allows organisms to adapt to their environment. Who says true? Who says false? Many of you have not raised your hand. Let's try this again. Who says true? Who says false? Those of you who raised your hand were too quick because it's actually false. Why is this false?
Evolution takes place over a long time. Where it's like adaptation.
So that's one possible way of interpreting it. But if we say just species or organisms as a class, right? That's still a false statement. So even if we allow for long periods of time, why is it still false?
Because adaptations happen and then that causes evolution.
I'm trying to think if that's a rewording of that phrase. That's still false, actually, in terms of evolution. Yes, sir.
It doesn't allow organisms to evolve, but the greater species as a whole.
So that's kind of the same point that, but if we take organisms to be the whole class of species, then this is still false. Yes, ma'am.
Is it according to Darwin that the species just like evolve without like specific reason?
So how do species change? What's that process? Mutation. Now, is mutation something that's directed to adaptation? No. Mutation just happens, right? Species develop all sorts of weird little peculiarities, extra fingers, new colored hair, stuff like that. But that's not adaptation, that's just change. And the idea that organisms adapt to their environment is a Lamarckian theory, the idea that, okay, a giraffe neck will get longer because a giraffe wants to eat high trees. But that's not how evolution happens. You just have some giraffes that have long necks and some giraffes that have short necks. And it just happens to be the long neck giraffes that survive. Right? So evolution is not goal-oriented. It's not directed. Right? You don't, as an organism or as a species or as life on Earth, change in order to fit a particular niche. You just change. Right? But all these organisms will fill all these niches, and the ones that can fill and survive those niches are the ones that will survive to the next generation. It looks like adaptation. It looks like there's change to a particular direction. But in fact, change is just random. Right? It's only through survival of the fittest that you get this, sort of evolution and adaptation to the environment. The species themselves are not adapting in response to the environment. Right? The response to the environment is something that species animals do just because that's how they survive. But evolution is a completely different process. Evolution is just change. But it's change with external criteria. And those external criteria are harsh. You live or you don't live. You pass on your genes or you don't pass on your genes. But it's not adaptation toward a goal. Right? It's just survival of the fittest. That's a huge different change in conception, right? Up until, again, sort of the mid-19th century, this would have been thought to be true, right? When we look at all sort of the unusual adaptations that animals have to live in different environments. But they were not directed. They were not purposeful. It's just survival of the fittest. Okay. So that's an important concept to keep down. Oh, you got wrong, so keep it in mind. All right, dog breeds. What kind of selection are dog breeds?
Partridge.
Good. What's the other kind of selections? Natural. There's one other big one.
Sexual selection.
Sexual selection. So sexual selection is an interesting one because it gives rise to traits that may not necessarily be good for the survivability of the organism, right? A good example are peacock feathers, or these big feathers for birds of paradise. Prevents them from flying. This is, kind of retro evolution if you think about it. Birds, flight is a really good thing. To develop, super huge feathers so you can't fly is not necessarily a great adaptation for survivability, but it is something that's selected for in terms of the sort of mating process of those species. All right. So all three of those are happening in our world today. All right. 96% of the atoms in our body are made of 4 elements. What 4 elements are those? Carbon,
Hydrogen.
oxygen,
Nitrogen.
hydrogen, and
Nitrogen.
nitrogen. Good, excellent. All right. What's the other two? What's the next 2%?
Phosphorus.
Not potassium. Potassium is an important one that gets overlooked a lot, but it's not quite as high. Phosphorus and sulfur. So phosphorus we're going to talk about today because phosphorus is important for the metabolism, the energy storage in our bodies. Sulfur is a common element in many of the proteins and amino acids that we have in our body. And so sulfur seems like less useful, but in fact it's in many, many different proteins. But phosphorus is actually something that has very specific use. All right, most of the basic biochemicals used by life on Earth are found where originally?
The sun.
Nope, too hot. But you're close.
The inside of the earth.
Too hot. What is this class called?
Life in the universe.
And where are the chemicals found?
The universe.
In space, all right? In space, all right? Astrobiology, stuff in space. A lot of the sort of basic amino acids, nucleobases, carbohydrates are found on meteors, are found just floating around in space around stars, right? In certain solar disks. There's something like several dozen fairly simple but getting more complex carbohydrates that are found just floating around in space. And so the question about where these things come from is actually pretty easy because we see them all over the universe, mostly because they're made out of some of the most common elements that are in the universe, right? These are just very simple combinations of the most common elements, right? What happens once those things get on the Earth is, of course, a whole other question about the evolution of life on Earth, which we'll probably talk about next week. Okay, any questions on these things? Again, possible source of test material. All right, so today we're going to be talking a little more detail about 2 of the main processes of life, metabolism, and sort of intersection of metabolism and structure. So how do we actually organize life based on how life uses energy and uses the energy to create its own structure. I'll talk a little bit about genetics and then sort of touch briefly on the tree of life at the end. So again, out of these 6 sort of characteristics that we see are as common for life organisms, at least here on Earth, these are the 2 things that we're interested in today. And the first of them, energy utilization, is often sort of bulked into this term called metabolism. Now, I have to make sure it's clear that metabolism is actually a very specific form of energy usage or energy generation that's involved with chemical energy. We do have examples of energy that we'll talk about a little bit later that involve not chemical bonds, but in fact radiant energy, for example, from the sun, right? That's the process of photosynthesis. There are some organisms that can actually use heat energy from other sources, for example, from the Earth, right? We're going to focus mostly on chemical energy production, metabolism, because that's most of the energy that happens here on the planet. All right, so really basically it's just a set of chemical reactions that happen in living organisms to maintain life, a very general term. It can be broken down into things that break down chemicals, all right? That's called catabolism, all right? If you've heard the word catalyst, all right? Catalyst, we usually think sometimes in English, catalyst is like helping things happen, right? Bringing people together. In fact, it's the opposite in chemistry. It's breaking things apart. You don't really want to catalyze a relationship because that's bad for the relationship. It breaks it apart, all right? You want to animalize a relationship. That's the opposite of building up. So if you're anabolic steroids, all right, anabolic steroids are meant to beef up muscles illegally, but that's chemically how it works. Right? And there's lots of different things that connect up in the whole sort of circle of metabolism, right? We're going to talk a lot about biochemistry, the actual chemical reactions that lead to catalysis and metabolysis, but it also intersects with genetics and molecular biology. And there's different things, the environments in which these reactions occur, the fact that these reactions occur in life in cells, right? That's common for all life on Earth. That's one of the important key commonalities. That provides a separate environment for these reactions to occur, which means many of these reactions would not occur except for the protected environment inside a cell. So that's where the cell structure is very important. It also, life, all right, in general, has developed a number of enzymes that allow some of the reactions to happen that normally wouldn't happen, again, in nature. And so that's something that's important for the continuation of life. And then we'll talk about ATP, which is the sort of battery of life, the thing that stores the energy. And it's common in every single living organism. Dimitri Dayan said this in the talk on Thursday at the bioluminescence lab. ATP is present in everything. It's in everything, every form of life. And he mentioned this sort of experiment for Mars of actually looking for ATP in Mars, because that's the sort of chemical signature for life, the main one. Right? Somehow we've all evolved the same mechanism for storing energy, and it's in a molecule that contains 3 phosphorus atoms. Okay, so now we didn't talk much about the structure of life, and you can take a look at this in the book. Again, this is kind of high school biology, so I didn't want to spend too much time on it. But again, most of life is organized in different types of cells. Right? We have animal cells, we have plant cells, we have much simpler cells if we're talking about single-celled organisms. But many of them sort of share the same structures. And the one that we talk about, at least for life, for metabolism, is this little organelle called mitochondria. Now, mitochondria have an interesting history, we think. Many of the organelles we have in our cells probably didn't start in our cells originally, because the cell didn't exist originally, so you have to build these things up. The main theory is that for mitochondria and some of the other organelles were actually independent species, independent little bacteria that found it was useful to spend their time inside cells. Instead of a virus, for example, invading the cell and taking over genetic machinery and destroying the cell, early mitochondria found the cell a nice place and decided to stay and specialized into just a simple powerhouse organelle. So mitochondria can't live on their own. They have to live inside a cell because that's where they get their nutrition is. It's sort of a symbiotic relationship. But it has its own separate DNA. And in fact, one of the main processes of tracing heredity, particularly through the matriarchal line, through your mothers, is looking at the DNA of mitochondria cells, because the DNA are literally passed from cell to cell, and that includes the egg cells in which we eventually evolve, right? So there's clear evidence that these two things are originally different species, but of course now they merge into one species, which is us. Right? But keep in mind, we have actually multiple sets of DNA, even down at the cellular level.
Would the nucleus in the mitochondria have different DNA? Is that possible?
Yes, and that's actually true. So mitochondria DNA is very simple because its job is actually pretty simple. It's just got to produce energy. It's actually a very complicated job, but much less complicated than growing an entire body. So yeah, in animal organisms, you can have completely different DNA in the nucleus and in the mitochondria. And in fact, mitochondria DNA, except for mutation, tends to be pretty stable because it's literally just reproducing the same exact mitochondria as you produce new cells. So in sexual reproduction, you're merging the cells of the two parents. Mitochondria don't merge genetics from two different places. They just make copies of themselves over time. So mitochondria DNA is actually one of the main tracers for looking at the deep sort of DNA root of human evolution, for example, because it's much more stable than for example, nuclear DNA. All right, so these are the sites of metabolism. You can have different kinds of reactions in here. And again, remember that these are metabolisms. This is either breaking up or putting together molecules. Those kind of reactions can either produce energy. So when you start off with some kind of energy contained in the chemical bonds, that's what we're talking about in terms of energy. It's just the energy contained in those chemical bonds. Whatever the reaction is, if at the end you have less energy in those bonds, then you have to get rid of that energy somehow. So that's an exothermic reaction. And the opposite is if you're taking some energy in, and at the end you have less energy, more energy stored in those bonds, then it's an endothermic reaction, right? Heating and cooling reactions. Now, in reality, the way this sort of sketch is made, it usually requires a little bit of energy to start these reactions, even if in the end you net gain. So a good example we'll talk about a little bit later is the sort of, it's glycolysis, the splitting. So anytime you hear olysis, some kind of cis, that's split, right? And glycolysis is the splitting of glucose. That's one of our main energy generation reactions in our body. And it requires a little energy to get started. We'll see that in just a little bit. But once you start that reaction, in the end, you get some energy out. So the initial boost is the activation energy. Okay, I'm going to do this. So since your homework this week involves some discussion about biochemistry and energy, I wanted to sort of go in a little bit depth of the actual sort of process of calculating these numbers. How many of you have taken a chemistry class here at UCSD? How many have taken it at least in high school? Okay, good. All right. So some of the stuff I talk about won't be mysterious. So again, the key thing is that biochemistry, all of biochemistry can be reduced to just one idea that the energy, this is the energy contained in the molecules that life uses, right? Organic molecules, even non-organic molecules in some cases for some species. But the whole process of metabolism is figuring out how to extract the energy from these chemicals to do something, or to store the energy you have excess, for example, from photosynthesis, into a structure in which that energy can remain. All right? And it's all about the energy contained in molecular bonds. And so you can find online in different studies. This is actually from a study by NASA to look at extreme forms of life. We'll talk about it a little bit at the end. Each of these bonds, so between hydrogen and hydrogen or nitrogen and nitrogen, has some kind of energy associated with it. And the units that is shown here is its energy in kilojoules per mole. All right, so for those of you who may be rusty on chemistry, remember a mole is 6 times 10 to the 23 of anything. That's Avogadro's number. So if you have a mole of atoms, it's 6 times 10 to the 23 atoms. If you have a mole of molecules, it's 6 times 10 to the 23 molecules. If you have a mole of Skittles, it's 6 times 10 to the 23 Skittles. Okay, good point. It's a large number. And it's a large number because atoms and molecules are tiny compared to this sort of macroscopic world that we live in. All right? But it's an important conversion factor because a mole of any substance, right, 6 times 10 to the 23 of any substance, the mass of that mole is equal to the atomic mass, or the atomic mass or the nuclear mass of the actual elements within them. So, as an example, H2O, H is 1 proton, so that's an atomic mass of 1. Oxygen is 8 protons, 8 neutrons, so that's an atomic mass of 16. Add these all up, you get 18 because there's 2 hydrogens. That's the atomic mass of the molecule, but it's also the physical mass in grams of a mole of water, right? So this is just a conversion factor. This is probably super simple, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page. All right, so when these kind of bond energies are given, it's giving the amount of energy. Joules is a unit of energy, right? SI unit of energy. Kilojoules is thousands of those. So this is it's 400, say for example, for HH bonds, there's 436,000 joules in a mole, 6 times 10 to the 23 particles of H2, hydrogen gas. Is that clear? I'm going to jump forward just to make sure I get every step here. Okay. All right, so you can find lists of all these kind of different bonds. Anyway, these are all set up based on sort of the physical properties of the atoms themselves, where their electrons sit, the charge of the nucleus versus the charge of the electrons around. Most of these are just empirical numbers that are just, you can just look up. All right, now, this is one way of writing this energy down. Another way of writing this energy down is something called electron volts. And this gets back to the idea that chemical bonds are made by the electromagnetic force. And if you remember from any of your physics classes in high school or here at UCSD, that an electron volt is the amount of energy gained by an electron in 1 volt of potential. Anybody not remember that? Okay. So if you have, if you have a battery, I don't have a battery. Oh, I do have a battery. Oh, I forget it. Here's a battery. What does it say in really tiny print in the middle there? 1.2 V. That is the voltage of this battery. That is the essentially electrical potential. The oomph that this battery gives to push a charged particle along, a particular electron in this case. Right? So different storage elements will provide different amounts of voltage. You can have really little things like this that will only produce electrons with a little bit of energy. You can have huge voltage systems like our electrical power systems, which are, have so much voltage that they can cause a huge current to run through your body, which is very bad. And batteries not so much. So this, EV, electron volt, is just a unit of energy. And it's quantified by how much energy is gained by electron in a volt, but this is just another unit of energy. It's a very small unit of energy. But it turns out to be the unit of energy that exactly matches the energy contained in these chemical bonds. Because if you just go through the calculations, right, mole is 6 times 10 to the 23 particles. You can convert joules to electron volts. There's a conversion factor in there. But in the end, if you multiply all these numbers by 100th, so knock off 2 decimal places, that is the bond energy in electron volt. Each bond has an energy of somewhere around here. And you can see there, if I put the decimal places all here, they're all of order somewhere between 1 and 10 electron volts. So the electron volt is the natural unit of energy for a chemical bond. Just like the astronomical unit is the natural unit of length for planets going around the sun, right? Because the Earth is exactly 1. We talked about this sort of in the first lecture, sort of natural units of numbers. Electron volt is the natural unit of energy for chemical bonds. Okay, so if I wanted to write instead of how much energy is contained in a mole of water, and I want to ask how much energy is contained in the bonds of 1 water molecule, then that's just adding up all of the bonds that are inside water. So for example, water is H2O, so there's going to be a link between O and H, and there's going to be a second link between O and H. So that's 2 bonds that are 3.66 EV. So that's about 7.2, 7.3 EV total. Yes, ma'am.
So why wouldn't it be one bond between H and H and the other bond between H and H?
So good, excellent question. Let's see. Erase this board. Actually, hold on one second. I'm going to get a better board. Never. Can I get a hand? Because the fundamental flaw of overhead projectors is that it blocks the board that you actually want to use. Thank you. Okay, so your question was, if we have an O, an H, and an H, why isn't it a bond like this? No, but that's a good question.
That was my question.
Okay, so if they were just drawing lines between letters, that would be perfectly acceptable, right? But it turns out that each of these elements bond in specific ways depending on how many electrons they have in their outer shell. So the easiest one to remember is hydrogen. Hydrogen is 1 proton, which means how many electrons it has? 1, because it's neutral, right? And the first shell, electron shell around an atom can fit exactly 2 electrons. And so an H atom we do our dot diagrams in metabolism chemistry, can fill in one space for an electron. And so when it bonds to something else, it's looking for a single bond with a single element. It only needs to fill in that one electron space. So, a good example is hydrogen. Hydrogen also has one electron. So these two share those electrons, and you get a single bond that connects them. Okay. So in this case, this won't work because hydrogen has got two connections to it. Now, sometimes this happens. So I'm not going to completely rule this out. But in the chemistry that we're going to talk about in this class, it never happens. We're doing simple chemistry. Now, oxygen, where it sits in the periodic table, can form two bonds. So the easiest way to make this work is to do something like this, because now H has one bond each, and the O has two bonds each. Right? Carbon can form 4 bonds. That's why carbon is so awesome. Right? You may know how many bonds nitrogen can form? Only in extreme situations. What's a common simple molecule involving nitrogen? What's like the simplest, well, I would say the second simplest molecule. The simplest molecule is actually what we're using. What's that called? Ammonia. Okay. So NH3. We know the H's form one bond. And that tells us how many bonds nitrogen forms. 3. Okay. So you can also cases where, atoms bond to themselves. So hydrogen can form one bond with itself, so it makes a simple bond like that. Oxygen can form 2 bonds, so when you get O2, each of them wants to form 2 bonds, so they form 2 bonds with each other, and you get something like a double bond. Right? When nitrogen forms with each other, how many bonds, what kind of bond does that make? Triple bond. Okay, so hopefully some of this is kind of trickling back in the brain a little bit. But these are all just basic chemistry rules just from the electrons and the settings of these molecules. Now, how can we then use that? So let's take an example then. It's actually an example straight from your problem set of methane, right? Methane is kind of the simplest organic molecule that we deal with, right? It's just a carbon. Carbon can form 4 bonds. So all we do is just place those 4 bonds with hydrogen atoms and you've got a methane molecule. Right? Simple, easy peasy. So we can ask how much energy is contained in the bonds of this molecule. Well, it's just a matter of looking at how many bonds there are, what type they are, and just looking at a reference table to see how much each of those bonds is worth. All right. So in this case, how many bonds do we have?
4.
What kind of bonds are those? Okay. And so I look at my table here. I've got an HC. Now it's written in 413 kilojoules per mole. So if I want that to be my energy, I can use that. Or I can divide by 100. Now I'll get 4.13 electron volts per bond. Yeah? Okay. So there's 4 of those. So if I multiply that out, 4 CH bonds, multiply that out, I have 16.52 eV. This is the chemical energy of this particular one molecule. It's that simple, all right? So the things you need to know are what are the bond energies and what does the molecule look like? And to be frank, most of the molecules we're going to do in this class are going to be real simple. The most complicated one which you have on your homework assignment is glucose. And that has 24 atoms in it, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually pretty simple to draw. Right? So that's the whole thing. So now, this is the case of just looking at the energy. Now I should say something. This energy is the energy contained in the methane molecule. Atoms naturally want a bond. That's sort of their preferred state. Remember, atoms are made of positive and negative parts, right? Positive nucleus, negative electrons. They actually kind of want to form these bonds, these sharing of electrons. So it's actually a lower energy state to be in a molecule than to be a free atom. And so when we talk about the chemical energy, in fact, that energy is a potential energy. It's a negative energy. So if I've got just a carbon and 4 hydrogen atoms spinning around, doing whatever they want, but not bonded at all, there's no chemical energy in that case. Now they may be moving and jiggling around. That's kinetic energy. But if I'm just looking at chemical energy, no chemical energy, and just free atoms. As soon as I get them into a molecule, they love it. All right, that's preferred energy state. That means the total energy of the system, at least of these atoms, has actually gone down. You have negative energy. So when you see energy of formation of molecules in literature and chemistry books, it's usually a negative number because this is literally potential energy that's sort of locked up in these chemical bonds. In order to break these, I have to put energy in. I have to add energy to the system to get these bonds to break up. So I have to have a negative energy in a molecule in order to get to zero when all the atoms are apart. Does that make sense? This is probably the most confusing part of biochemistry, that this is a negative number, right? But it's negative because this is a lower energy state than just free atoms. The atoms want to be bonded together. And in order to unbond them, you have to add energy. Yeah.
So by negative chemical, like negative energy, you just mean that that's what's absorbed by the molecule to make it a molecule?
So it's a little more complicated than that. It's actually, so if I take these 5 elements and I smash them together and they form this molecule, I actually have a set that's in a lower energy state. So now I've got all this energy left over, right? So, and actually in the process of making methane in this way, I actually release energy. If this is the way I made it, we'll show an example in a little bit that this is not necessarily how the way you make methane, by taking atoms from random places and putting them together. But because this is a low energy state, I now have some extra energy that's, for example, heat. So in the formation of methane in this process, I actually gain a little bit of energy in return, which is the stuff that I stored away here. And that goes into these molecules moving around. Yes, ma'am.
So on the homework or the midterm, if you give us a problem with this, do you want it to be negative? Because on the last example, it was just a positive.
So just to alleviate worry, since it's on the homework for the first time this week, I do not have this problem on the midterm. That would be cruel and unusual to introduce it the day before the midterm. Particularly since this is not in the book at all. This is just me. This is extra material for the course. But to answer your question, if I were to ask for the chemical energy of this molecule, the correct form would be into negative 16.52. I probably would be fine with just 16.5, positive 16.52, as long as you understand that it's negative. And I'll show why that's important in just a moment. That's why it's negative. Okay, any questions on this? All right, so just to review, chemical bonds are stored here. Can you put away your phone? Or are you looking at chemical stuff? Thanks. Chemical energy is stored in these bonds. Atoms like to be bonded together, and so this is a preferred lower energy state. And so when you have a total kinetic energy, chemical energy, it's a negative energy. Good? Okay. All right, so the next step is, so like I said, this is kind of artificial. We don't just take random hydrogen and carbon atoms and just stick them together to make molecules. There are reactions, and that's the whole part of metabolism, is the reactions. And so an example of a reaction with methane is when you burn it, right? Combustion. Combustion is just combining molecules with oxygen, right? It's something that happens in our atmosphere because we have oxygen in it, right? If our atmosphere did not have oxygen, you actually can't burn things. So I can't go to Mars and start a campfire, for example. So there's no oxygen, right? But in the place of oxygen, you can take carbohydrates like methane and burn them, and you end up releasing energy. And we'll see why there's more. By the way, methane is the main component of natural gas. And so when I say combustion, I literally mean burning gas, right? That's what methane combustion is. All right, so if you actually want to figure out in this reaction, if you've got more energy left over at the end, which is exothermic, right, producing that energy, or if you have to add energy for this to happen, that's an endothermic reaction. You actually have to add up all of the bonds on both sides. Right? So this is just a repetition of the same process, but now looking at the entire reaction. So I'm going to step through one, and then I'm going to have you guys do one on your own. So this is methane combustion. All right, so these are what all of these molecules look like. Right? Here's our methane again. Oxygen likes to have 2 bonds, so it forms a double bond. Right? And in order to balance the elements here, we have to have 2 oxygen molecules for every methane molecule, so there's 2 of those. Carbon dioxide carbon likes 4 bonds, oxygen likes 2. The only configuration that works is double bonds between the C's and O's. And then H2O we've already talked about. So again, if you're chemistry wizards, you can write these down. If you're not, you can look them up. I mean, this is not a chemistry class, so I just want to get through basically a biochemistry. Now, what do we do with that information? How would we figure out what the energy is stored in these bonds?
You go back to the table that you had earlier.
Exactly. Yeah, look it up because there's no way you're going to know that ahead of time. So I'm just going to give you the numbers because I don't have room to put the table and all these diagrams in here. But this is what they are. So we already talked about the carbon-hydrogen bond. There's the oxygen-oxygen double bond, 4.95 eV. There's the carbon-oxygen double bond, 7.99. Notice there's two of them in here. And here's oxygen-hydrogen. All right. Again, you just look these numbers up. Okay. And now it's just a matter of, again, adding up the bonds. So we already did this with methane. There's 4 of these, right? So that's just 4 times 4.13 negative, because it's energy stored, it's potential energy. So minus 16.52 negative EV. Yes, ma'am.
When, like for that one, is that kind of how when we turn like 2 hydrogen into helium, it loses energy?
No, that's a nuclear process, right? So that's changing elements. We're not changing elements. We're just breaking these electromagnetic bonds. When you go from hydrogen to helium, you're actually putting another proton inside the nucleus, and that's a completely different reaction. That's fusion. This is biochemistry. If we did nuclear fusion for biochemistry, we would be crazy energetic, right? We'd blow ourselves up to do that. This is much lower energy. Okay. Okay, so the oxygen-oxygen bond here, so we've got, for each molecule of oxygen, we've got 1 double bond. We've got 2 oxygen molecules. So that's just 2 times that number. So that's minus 9.9. Yeah. CO2, we've got 1 molecule, but 2 bonds. So again, that's twice this number. Minus 15.98 eV. And the water is a little more tricky because you've got 2 OH bonds per molecule and 2 molecules. So how many bonds you got? 4. All right. So that's it. That's all of them. And now all I do is just add up the 2 signs. So when I add up these 2, I get minus 26.4. When I add up these 2, I get minus 34.5. This is why it's important to think of these negative numbers, because this is actually a lower energy than this one. In the process of going from here to here, I've lost chemical energy. I've gone to a more negative number. Where does that chemical energy go? I can't read this. Yes, you gotta use the voice. Heat, yeah. It goes into another form of energy, which is heat. So what kind of reaction is this? Is it endothermic or exothermic? Exothermic, of course. It's burning gas. Burning gas is hot. It produces heat. We already knew that. But now we can see quantitatively how that is, right? Again, it's just adding up the bonds. You want to try this on your own?
Yeah.
Okay. No. Yes, come on. All right. There's your reaction. Ethane combustion. Let me give you not much time because we're almost out of time, but I'm going to give you, oh no, we go to 11, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to give you 10 minutes. You can work together if you need help. Yes, ma'am.
Is this like our in-class?
This is your in-class exercise. Make sure your name and the date is on the front. Raise your hand if you are stuck. Yeah. My equation unbalanced, that is possible. Probably when I just copied out the
Probably
internet.
needed 2 of 1 of the C2H6.
Yep. Okay, let me make sure I get this all. Yeah, this is like hugely unbalanced. Okay, sorry, hold on 1 second here. My partner is a chemistry teacher who would have killed me if I had actually shown that in her class. Who needs more time?
2 minutes.
Okay. Okay, would anyone like to come up and walk through their solution? Sure, please, thank you. Maybe use the board easier.
I can just point it up here.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm just gonna go from left to right. So first I count up all the CH bonds in one ethane molecule, so that's 6 total, and then so that's 6 times 4.13, and then you add 3.48 electron volts to that. And that total you multiply by 2 because there's 2 molecules in that, and that comes out to negative 56.52 electron volts. And then the next one is the oxygen bond, and you just multiply this number by 7 because there's 7 bonds. That comes out to negative 34.65. And then you add that together because that's this side of the equation. That comes out to negative 91.17 electron volts. And then the reactants, you take 7.99, you multiply it by 2 because there's 2 bonds in that molecule. And then you multiply that by 4, and that comes out to negative 63.92. And then you add that to the final molecule, which is the water, and that comes out. So you have the 2 OH bonds in one molecule. So you multiply this number by 2, and you multiply it by 6 because there's 6 molecules, and that comes out to negative 55.56. And then this side of the equation comes out to negative 119 electron volts roughly. And because that side, the equation has more than this, you lose energy, which means it's exothermic. So yeah.
Okay. Anybody get anything different or have a slightly different result or a completely different result? Does anybody know what ethane is? We've seen ethane. Ethane is also a major component of natural gas. Natural gas is usually the 2 most simplest carbohydrates. Methane is the simplest. Ethane is the next simplest. You go up to C3, C4. You go to more complicated molecules. Propane, for example, is C5, H10. But this is this is sort of the 2 basic simple molecules. So all those numbers are the same ones I got after I corrected my mistakes. And indeed, you're getting more energy out at the end. So this is exothermic reaction. Now, not all reactions end up this way, right? There are many cases where, for example, the bonds that you form on this side, actually, let's go take it back here. The bond energies on this side might be much, much higher than the bond energies on this side, in which case you're actually losing energy in the process of breaking some of these things down. There's many reactions, for example, like if I try to oxidize water, right? Combustion of water. You ever heard of combustion of water? Somebody shaking your head, because I've never seen water catch fire. It's not exothermic, right? It's not a reaction that it favors heat energy coming off. But something like ethane or wax in a candle, right? Wax in a candle keeps burning because the reaction that combusts the wax, which is a carbohydrate, it's actually a lipid, has a net exothermic reaction, which keeps the reaction going, right? And produces heat. So you can see exothermic reactions pretty simply. We can also calculate exactly how much energy you're getting out of these just by counting up the bonds. It's just a matter of accounting. Right? Not very complicated. But this is the basis of all of biochemistry. So if you can get this, you don't have to take those biochemistry classes at all, I swear. All right, any questions on that? So that was basically how you do the last question in the homework. Yeah, or the second last question.
Just to clarify, how do you know when to divide? You said if you divided like the first one by 2, is it because there's
Well, he didn't divide. So you take one molecule, he added up all the CH bonds and the 1 CC bond, right? And then there's 2 of those molecules. So whatever you get out of one molecule, you multiply by 2.
Oh, okay, I just thought I heard divide. And that's like,
It might be because that's down below here, but it's really multiplication.
okay.
Now, there's things you can do. So I should take a step back here. So this is how much energy. So how much energy, net energy you gain? Something like 28 electron volts per molecule, per 2 molecules of ethane per reaction. All right. So for example, I could turn this into an energy per mole, right? That's multiplying by 100. That gives me kilograms per mole. And then I could calculate how much energy that is per mass of ethane, because the atomic mass of ethane gives me the molecular mass, or sorry, the molar mass of ethane, right? C is 12, so there's 4 of them here, it's 48. H is 1, there's 12 from there, that's 60. This is 60 grams in 1 mole. And I could, for example, divide how much energy I get out of that by the mass of ethane, and I can get in energy density, how much energy I expect for a pound of ethane versus a pound of methane versus a pound of propane. You can do these calculations pretty simply. Again, it's just counting up these bonds. That's how those come out. Okay. All right, so that's kind of the end products, right? How much energy we get out or put into these reactions. The actual process still has this activation energy and may prevent some of these reactions from happening. But this is one of the great things about enzymes being developed in life systems, is that the enzymes essentially kind of cheat the way through this activation energy. If we just did this purely chemical process, right? If this was the only reaction that I cared about, then there would be some activation energy I'd have to get in. I mean, think about it. You literally have to put energy in to break these bonds up to then reform these bonds. That's the activation energy. Yeah? But if you have an enzyme can sometimes help catalyze, again, break up those molecules just by the particular structure of the enzyme itself. The enzyme itself doesn't change, but its structure or its chemical potential in such a way that it can allow the reactants to come in, break off at a much lower activation energy. The same net energy happens at the end. It's still the same reaction. Because it's facilitated by these enzymes, you don't have the same activation energy to start the reaction. So that's the power of enzymes, and that's why they're very crucial for life. Now, where does all this energy, so we have these exothermic reactions, right? We break down carbohydrates into their basic components. Where does all this energy go? Well, again, as I mentioned, this goes into a particular molecule called ATP. So here's the structure of ATP, a lot more complicated than methane and ethane. But the important point are these 3 sections at the end, right? These sort of phosphate sort of segments here at the end contain a lot of energy because there's a lot of energy stored in these PO bands. Right? The bond energy is very high in those. If you ever study something like explosives, if you're into explosives, NO bonds are also very powerful. And when you hear about TNT, the N in TNT is nitrogen, right? So you can have lots of energy stored in those. Phosphorus is the same kind of thing. It's actually in the same sort of column on the periodic table. Bonds are very, very strong. So again, all of life systems contain energy in this particular molecule that either goes between 2 phosphate groups or 3 phosphate groups. And when it adds this other phosphate group, that is actually storing chemical potential energy. Yes, ma'am.
Is the energy in the bonds actually related to the equation E equals mc squared? Is that a representation of that, or?
No, so a great question. So the E equals mc squared is a huge amount of energy because it's the actual mass of the element, for example. These are tiny amounts of energies that are just stored in the bond itself, just in the bond. And that's the electromagnetic force. The E equals mc squared is probably the best way to think about it. It's a nuclear binding force. It's a strong force that keeps those nucleus together. That's like 6 orders of magnitude more energy than what we're talking about here. So the same kind of question, why don't we have biochemistry that takes hydrogen and puts it into helium? It's because life would literally explode if that was the case. So much energy is released in that process. Whereas we can deal with like little electron volt bounce of energy and still keep molecules together. So yeah, that's a much higher energy scale. All right, so again, this is the key energy molecule, and the very basic reaction is that anytime you have energy coming into the cell, it takes the ADP, the 2-phosphate group, uses that energy to stick on this extra phosphate to the end, right? That's now storing energy. When the cell needs energy, it breaks off that phosphate group through a process called hydrolysis, which is separation by water. Remember that cis term, this term, that's separation, right? Breaks up this piece and liberates the energy that it put in over here. This cycle happens gazillions of times in all of our cells every single day, to every living organism on this planet. This is the energy cycle of life. And it's just switch between these 2 molecules. Now, what puts in the energy depends on what kind of energy source we're talking about. We'll talk about a couple different ones. What the energy is used for depends on the organism, but this is kind of the medium. This is the currency of energy inside the cell in this process. Okay, so, and again, important thing is that all of this happens. This conversion happens inside mitochondrial organelles. That's where all this conversion happens. Now, where does the energy come from? So this kind of now starts to go on what actually is the animal that you're talking about. And we have sort of two different classes of animals in terms of what kind of energy we're talking about. The first most basic one is the energy comes directly from the sun, radiant energy. Right? This is photolysis. And this is kind of the base of our energy system of life because this is free energy coming to us from our star, right? Ultimately from fusion inside the core. But early on in sort of the history of development of life, this molecule chlorophyll was developed, and that molecule is able to convert some of the visible and UV light from the sun into usable energy, and the energy is then stored into what? Where is the energy stored once this chlorophyll gets it from the sun? ATP, yes, thank you. ATP. I want you to remember that, ATP. So whenever, this reaction here, this is the reaction, you get, you've got carbon dioxide in the air, you've got water in the water or in the air, depending on how you get it. You add some light energy, and you create these structures, and you also create ATP, all right? So it's getting the energy from the sun. All right, now what kind of reaction is this reaction? It's endothermic, exothermic, or energy neutral. Which this is a pretty easy one, so we don't have to do the cards, but get them out because we'll have a much harder one next. Who says endothermic? Who says exothermic? Who says energy neutral? Okay. Okay. What is that? I don't know if that's a hand raise or that's just picking your tooth. This is definitely endothermic because you're starting with energy. You're putting energy in at the beginning on the left side. And then you're storing that energy into chemical bonds. In the end, you're left with less free energy than when you start off with. Right? That's a definition of endothermic reactions. All right. This one I want to do a vote on. Are you even paying attention to the question? Okay, count of three. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, now is the time to get the line. Okay, there's actually quite a lot of mix. Okay, find the neighbor next to you who probably has 2 different answers than you and tell them why you're right, explain to them why you're right, convince them you're right using scientific arguments. You've got 20 seconds, go.
I was also thinking about the reason I should do for self-certification has to get comes in like the forms of so I did like they get to from each item. Do you want to tell me?
No, you can't. What's incorporated in what makes the tree?
You could also do that because I don't think oil is true.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
The stuff of the tree.
I didn't fully understand the question, but when you said that, that's really nutrients. If that's what I was trying to
What's
understand.
the tree made of?
Yeah, so yeah, why do you say so?
Well, does the tree get its I mean, the soil's down here, but does it pull it up from the ground or does it pull from the ground? Where's the stuff of the tree?
I don't know why I thought that's a soil.
Okay, let's do, is everyone just done discussing? Did you convince your neighbors? You're absolutely right. All right, count of 3. 1, 2, 3. There were some hearts and minds changed, but in completely different directions. That's fantastic. All right, so I'm seeing two main answers, well, kind of three main answers. I'm seeing B, C, and D. I would say A is definitely not right, so sorry in the back. We should have been talking more in front here. So give me some arguments about these three. That's a big range. About the same amount as the tree's mass, a little less than the tree's mass, much less than the tree's mass. Those who picked B, which was the vast majority on this side of the room for some reason, this is the tree-heavy side. Why did you say that vast majority was made by the soil?
Well, we were thinking, at least I thought that the soil provides nutrients for the tree.
Okay.
And the tree, as it reproduces, like as the cells reproduce and it grows, it would incorporate those nutrients. And I mean, nutrients like nitrogen, each atom has mass, so that mass could be used to create the tree.
So nutrients like nitrogen, what other nutrients are usually in the soil?
Oxygen,
There's probably a little oxygen, yeah.
carbon, potassium, I don't know.
Okay, all right. What's the earth mostly made out of? We had this question. What are the two elements that are the most common elements inside the earth? Ooh, you guys got a lot of studying to do for Thursday. Not carbon and nitrogen. Those are common in the universe. What two are common in
Silicon
the earth?
and
Well, good, kept your notes.
oxygen.
Silicon and oxygen, sand, right? What is the ground made of? Sand. So oxygen is certainly a possibility. But how much silicon goes into a tree? Not much. I'm actually not sure. I mean, there's probably some silicon part of the tree, but I'm not sure that's a majority amount. What's the main component of a tree? What's the main component of us?
Carbon.
Carbon. All right. Where does that carbon come from?
The air.
Carbon dioxide. And how is it put into the tree?
Those little things that stomata or whatever.
Okay, so that's why it's brought in to the stomata. But how is that carbon then stripped from the carbon dioxide and put into the tree? Probably something to do with it. What is that? Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide and water and energy goes to carbohydrates and a little waste oxygen, which we happen to like a lot. By the way, we also like the little carbohydrates too because we eat them, right? But carbohydrates, remember, are the chemicals of structure and order. They're the things that build us, right? The reason we can walk around is because we're walking carbohydrates, right? Carbon bonds are very strong. They provide structure, right? Long chain carbons can be built into all sorts of different vesicles and stuff like that, and can be built into wood, right? Wood is basically a carbohydrate, a massive carbohydrate, a long chain carbohydrate. It gets that carbon from this process, from carbon dioxide. So trees are made of air. Very little of the tree is made out of soil. Nitrogen is definitely part of it, right? Although it's actually, I mean, there's nitrogen in the air, but it's very hard to get the nitrogen from the air because of that triple bond that nitrogen has. So it gets some from the soil. It gets some other things from the soil, but it's much less than the actual mass of the tree, right? Most of the tree and most of the plants are air that are converted into structure by this endothermic reaction called photosynthesis. Right? Really important reaction for life forms because that's what makes structure. All right, that's one energy source. Another energy source is just getting it from chemical compounds, right? And so you can get it from organic compounds like sugar, all right? Taking sugar, combining with oxygen, that's a combustion process. We just did that with methane and ethane. You can do that with glucose as well. What you get out is carbon dioxide, some water, same stuff, and a whole lot of energy, all right? This is our main energy source as organisms that eat other organisms, all right? Whether you're plants or animals, all right? This is how we get our energy. This is we are chemotrophs. We are organisms that get energy from chemicals, all right? Breaking down chemicals that are more complex to simpler ones. And again, you can either be organic or inorganic, and those are called lithotrophs. Now, as I mentioned, this process, I mentioned glycolysis. So when I said sugar, this particular molecule is a glucose molecule. So to extract the energy, we have a very complicated cycle, which I'm not going to go into because this is advanced organic chemistry. The only important I want to point out is that part of this reaction, so it starts here with glucose, ends up with some pyruvate that also goes on other reactions. But in order to start breaking that up, you have to put energy in. How does the energy get in? ATP, right? So 2 ATPs are broken up at the very beginning to start this reaction. The energy is extracted to break molecules. As it loops around, then it starts to reform and you get ATP back out of the end. And in the end, you get a net amount of ATP. You get a net amount of energy. That's glycolysis. And it's all mitigated, again, by this energy flow by the ATP. Any questions on that? Okay, so that's the two sources of energy. The other things that we have to think about are where does the structure come from? So that's the metabolism and the energy. Where does the structure come from? And that's really asking where does the carbon come from? Because remember, that carbon is the structure, those strong bonds, those 4 bonds that make complex structure, the double bonds that carbon can make. Makes very strong molecules, very strong structure. So where do we get the chemistry from, the carbon from? Well, again, it's actually broken down into 2 kinds of processes. One is carbon is taken from carbon dioxide, right? Literally extracting it from the air. These are called autotrophs because they can get carbon on their own, right? Just from the air around us. Or the carbon is extracted from other organisms. Those are called heterotrophs. And those are what we are, right? We eat things. What we eat provides us the carbon that allows us to grow our bodies. So this is kind of I mentioned at the beginning of the class that there's an organization for life. And this is really how we organize it. Where does the energy come from? And where does the carbon come from? Right? If the energy comes from light, this is a phototroph. If the energy comes from chemicals, it's chemotrophs. If the carbon comes from just breathing in the air, that's an autotroph. If the carbon comes from eating something, it's a heterotroph. And these are the wonderful Greek roots that we can just start to string together and to make really, really complicated words. So I'm going to go through these really quickly because we run out of time, but a tree is something that makes energy from sunlight. So it's a photo, and it takes carbon from what? The air. So it is a photoautotroph. Exactly. Okay. We are what? Heterotrophs, right? We get energy from chemicals and we eat things. Chemoheterotrophs. So next time you want to offend someone, tell them, hey, you're chemoheterotroph. So, yeah, well, I am too. All right. Now, here's a good question. What was the first organism likely? So there's one we probably would know for sure. The first organism, would it have to eat or would it have to get carbon from carbon dioxide? What would it eat?
From carbon dioxide, which is no organism.
Yeah, no organism, so it can't eat. So it's definitely an autotroph. Now, one of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about this is early on in the history of the Earth when the surface of the Earth was a terrible place to be. Super hot, lots of meteors falling, not great. We think most of early life formed early underground. And if that's the case, how would it get its energy? From chemicals. So we think that the first organisms were probably chemoautotrophs, that they extracted energy from chemicals in the soil or from, for example, these hot smokers, these volcanoes that are underwater, that are near the sort of Mid-Atlantic Ridge. We talked a little about this earlier on. We think that was the site of some of the earliest formations of life because it was able to extract the energy from the environment, from the chemicals in the environment, particularly sulfur compounds, and get carbon from carbon dioxide on its own. And today, we still see some chemoautotrophs in the environment. Right? These are what we call extreme organisms because they're not very common. But they are probably the relics of the first organisms on life because those organisms had to be able to make carbon on their own and really would have had access to light, at least early on. So by organizing these, our life forms by what they eat and how they get structured, we start to get some clues about what the early organisms were. Okay, so that's it for today. Remember, tomorrow there's the midterm review problem session. Make sure you give me your sheet so you can credit for the ticket today. And either way, I'll see you on Thursday for the midterm.
forgot to turn in a printed copy of